our speaker, Nancy Jay Crumbine. I will read the bio and then say a few more things. Nancy Jay Crumbine is a poet, which I will come back to, an associate visiting professor of writing and rhetoric at Dartmouth College. She holds a PhD in philosophy and master's degrees in philosophy and religion. She has lectured widely under the auspices of the New Hampshire and Vermont Humanities Councils, the National Council for the Aging, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and religious and education conferences, both in the US and in the UK. In addition to her published academic articles, she is the author of Humility, Anger, and Grace, Thoughts on Education and Time. This book, which she has copies of here, will sign and sell to you after this talk this evening. A terrific book. And note the flower on the cover. This will be relevant in just a moment. Of herself, she has said, "I try always to encourage students into authentic speech. I like humor in song. I dislike dead metaphors and cheap grace." And I asked Nancy before she came here this evening, had she been here before? I was going to give a talk. I've been here for a long time, and I missed at least one of her talks, I'm sorry to say. I didn't remember that she had been here. I was reintroduced to her by way of this book, The Still Puddle Poets, and I just want to read one poem of Nancy's in here. It's really my favorite poem in this whole book, and I asked her if I could do this, so I'm not embarrassing her, and I don't think I'm going to do a crummy job of reading, but she'll be the judge of that. This is called I Cannot Bear. "I cannot bear to love one more thing," she said, as she walked up to my newborn second son. "I cannot bear it, Nance," as she grabbed his bare left foot and shook it harder than a mother might, as she used to shake Sammy the cat's red-haired head, rattle it in her compulsive fist. "Oh, he loves it," she would say, as he ran for his life, and I would know, she knew, that was the joy we had between us. Never slant, she loved a fierceness, direct and overwhelmed by what she could not bear. "I cannot bear it either," I had wanted to say to her that afternoon when she stayed for tea, walked out to the lawn where she had placed the rocker years before, where she had written that poem about the lambs I raised, the two she had named Patience, Mercy, while I mowed the grass around her chair. "Poets and lovers are like Lupin," I might have said, over the sound of the mower that first afternoon in June. "Like Lupin that don't know the world is coming to an end, they just keep coming back, propagating themselves, standing tall but not together, loving every last one of themselves blue across the carpet field. How is it possible," I might have said then, "if the mower hadn't come between us, how is it possible, I write it out now, how is it possible to comprehend, to even say out loud, the Lupin has returned, despite the winter's dryness, its brittle, shoveled snows, the Lupin in dumb cobwebs of lavender across the field, fantastic, has returned." Pretty darn good. Please welcome Nancy Jay Crumbine.
Thank you, Bob. That was a beautiful reading, and never doubt that poets love to have their poems read by other people in front of them. It was really beautiful. I hear these poems differently when I... How's the volume? So you're all here despite this terrible day. Amen, yeah? So we're going to have fun with E.B. White and pick our spirits up. All I could think of all day long was, can't wait to get to St. Johnsbury and start reading. It's a reading more than anything tonight. I also want to say, if I didn't ask her permission, but where are you, Kathy? May I say you're here? I got an email last week from this woman, Kathy Hall, who's here in the second row, saying that she was looking forward to the talk. If the weather was good, she'd come, and that she knew E.B. White and Catherine White. Was the, let me get this right, the curator of his letters at Cornell, and then was in Brooklyn, Maine at the farmhouse with them, working on letters there as well. So during the question and answer, we're going to be using her a lot, and I think she'd be happy to talk to you as well when we mingle. So Kathy, really, really glad you're here. I want to thank Allie White especially. She's the grande dame of the First Wednesdays. Have you met her? Has she been here yet? I mean, you know her, but I was wondering. Anyway, she's. I've done lots of these talks. The last one a few years ago when I was here, it was on language of spirituality. Rumi, Kabir, Dickinson, and Jane Kenyon. Anyone know Jane Kenyon's work? Yeah, yeah. She was a dear friend of mine. So in that talk, I did a lot of talking. I read some, but I was analyzing, because when you're talking about Dickinson, for instance, you have to talk, because the poems, who can understand them? I can't. So you just keep talking until maybe you make some sense of them. In stark contrast to the sparseness and the concision of Dickinson, you have E.B. White, known by his friends as Andy White, writing prose that to this day everyone agrees is the best America has ever produced, that he is the quintessential essay writer. And how many of you have read some of his essays? How many of you have not read any of his essays? Yeah, okay, good. Well, you have a treat in store for you. So they're very understandable. I don't have to explain them. They're right there for you, and they're delightful. And so when Allie called me up and said, I want you to do E.B. White, and I said, well, I don't really know anything but Stuart Little, my favorite book, and Charlotte's Web. She said, well, you have a treat in store for you. I want you to read all the essays and give us a talk. And so it was, I've been reading him for the last 2 years now, and thanks to Allie White, and I just, well, you'll see if you don't know already how delightful these essays are. So I want to thank Allie White in particular, and I want to thank Bob for being one of the best hosts ever. And again, thank you so much for reading. So I have a stack of books that I'm going to be pulling from, and I'm going to start with my 10th birthday. On my 10th birthday, Mary Martin moved in across the street from E.B. White in Turtle Bay area of Manhattan. I know this because he begins his essay, Sootfall and Fallout, in the following manner. Now you're going to have to bear with me. Well, let me find these. They're supposed to be numbered, but of course. The first one isn't. Here we go. Okay. So I'll be reading from a collection, the collection of essays, almost all of them published in the New Yorker. And I'll be going through a chronology of his work, points of compass, and also One Man's Meat. Most of the essays that I'll be reading from tonight will be from there. So he opens this essay, Sootfall and Fallout, as you can tell from the title, is about air pollution and fallout. It was written October 18th, 1956. But this is how it opens, and it's quintessential White. So an essay about this horrible topic of pollution and fallout. In 1956, some of you may remember how scary things were then. No scarier than today, but never mind. It begins. This is a dark morning in the apartment, but the block is gay with yellow moving vans disgorging Mary Martin's belongings in front of a house a couple of doors east of here, into which, I should say from the look of things, she is moving. You all know Mary Martin, a la Peter Pan. People's lives are so exposed at moments like this. Their possessions lying naked in the street. The light of day searching out every bruise and mark of indoor living. It is an unfair expose, end tables with nothing to be at the end of. Standing lamps with their cords tied up in curlers, bottles of vermouth craning their long necks from cartons of personal papers, and every wastebasket carrying its small cargo of miscellany. The vans cause a stir in the block. Heads appear in the windows of number 230 across the way. Passers-by stop on the sidewalk and stare brazenly into the new home through the open door. I have a mezzanine seat for the performance, like a peeping Tom. I lounge here in my bathrobe and look down, held in the embrace of a common cold, before which scientists stand in awe, although they have managed to split the atom. You see how then he just so subtly introduces the atom, splits the atom, infect the topsoil with strontium-90, break the barrier of sound, and build the Lincoln Tunnel. So he pulls you back up at the end of that sentence. And then he goes on to a very difficult discussion. So that's by way of intro. I'm going to run through his life. Maybe Kathy will jump in if I screw up. But I want to just introduce you a little bit to this magnificent and interesting life. Born in 1899 in Mount Vernon, New York, the last of 6 children. By the time the third child comes around, there's quite a lot of freedom. By the time the 6th child comes around, nobody pays any attention at all. So he had quite a lot of freedom, was outside a lot, loved animals from a very beginning. And there's a book, by the way, I've brought lots of books for you to see. They're on the table, in addition to the book of mine. And one of them is a beautiful book by Sims about it's a biography of White, but focusing on his love of animals and the history behind Charlotte's Web. And I will be quoting briefly from Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little at the end, but the talk is, I gave this talk in Newport last June, and the librarian introduced it as that I was giving a talk on Charlotte's Web. And I said, no. And she said, well, mostly on Charlotte's Web. And I'm like, no. Carol, wonderful, wonderful librarian, but there was a little miscommunication there, but, and then she left, so I don't know. So he went to Cornell, where, and that's why he has his letters are there. He went to traveled across the country in a Model T, wrote a charming essay about that, worked in Seattle for a while, then got on, with very little money, got on a boat to Alaska, had a first-class cabin, and when he ran out of money, he went to the captain and said, I've run out of money, can you put me to work? So he put him to work in the mess hall for the firemen being those who stoked the fire of the boat, and then didn't know where to put him. So he kept him in the upper class cabin. It's hilarious how he writes about this. And so the upper class people didn't know what to do with him, and the firemen didn't know what to do with him. So he was sort of in between. It sort of sums up his life, actually, is that in-betweenness. 1925, he is hired at the New Yorker by Catherine White, who then, 2 years later, marries him. And they have a marvelous, Kathy was just telling me, that it was a privilege to be in the room with both of them 45 years later. They just had a magical, loving relationship right to the end. Catherine White, I want to say just briefly, in my researching E.B. White, I have discovered, I just didn't know anything about Catherine at all. She is such a powerhouse. I am going to try to get Allie to let me develop a talk on Catherine White herself. She made the New Yorker. Harold Ross began it, but without Catherine, never would have happened in the way that it did. She was the poetry and fiction editor for 50, 60 years at the New Yorker, and the powerhouse behind it all. More on her a little later. So they worked together in New York, and they also then bought this beautiful farm in Brooklyn, Maine. I had the privilege of seeing it. Serendipitously got hold of a cottage in Brooklyn, Maine last summer, so I was up there snooping around. The Whites purposely did not want it to be a public place. They didn't want Charlotte's Cafe to be set up in the barn. And they were very specific that it be sold privately and be kept in private hands. So it is privately owned, but you can see it from the road, and I was discreet enough in walking down the road several times, back and forth, pretending not to be looking at the farm. It's right on Allen's Bay. You can see the water from the farm. Gorgeous, huge, old white Maine farmhouse and beautiful barn. And what a lovely thing that it didn't become commercialized. So the Pulitzer Prize, I want to say, in 1978, this was a very unique Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer Prize is given for a particular work, as in Toni Morrison's Beloved, for instance. It's given for a work. The first and I believe only time the Pulitzer Prize was given for essentially lifetime achievement was to E.B. White on this occasion. It was quite something. He also received the Medal of Freedom from President Kennedy in '63 and was honorary degree from Dartmouth. I have the date somewhere in here. 1948. And at that time, Dartmouth was giving to all its graduating seniors White Flag, which is a wonderful little book of essays published in the New Yorker during the war. And this book is so timely, it's stunning. I will be reading one hilarious passage from it, but it's very, very powerful. And anyway, Dartmouth was giving these out. E.B. White said that they should be giving out Walden to every graduating senior, but I'm not going to go through that. That's just a very rough sketch of his work. They loved the farm. They finally gave up their New York apartment and settled at Brooklyn. Catherine died in '77. Very difficult time, and for White after that, as Kathy can speak to. And then, blanking on when White died. Kathy, help me. 85, yes, of course. I had 78 with the Pulitzer Prize in my head, so. Okay. Any additions to that chronology, Kathy? You want to? There's too many.
One thing that I think a lot of people are always curious about where he got the nickname Andy.
Yes, sure.
He hated the name Elwyn always, and all through his youth, and at Cornell he was trying to come up with some other way to sign his work. But he was lucky because at Cornell, everybody whose last name was White was automatically nicknamed Andy in honor of Andrew Dixon White, who was the first president of Cornell. So over the years, if anybody talked about him and called him anything but Andy, you knew that they didn't really know him, because if you got to know him, you got to call him Andy. So.
Yeah. Okay. So one of his earliest books that has one of the best the best title I've ever known is, which he wrote with James Thurber, was "Is Sex Necessary?" I immediately ran out after Allie called me about this to get that book. The text is a little dated. It's actually the only book that I found dated. The only part of his work that felt dated at all to me was that book, but the title must not go unmentioned. I will say another autobiographical comment about him is that it's very clear from the writing, and Kathy underlined this, that he suffered terribly from anxiety and very serious shyness. He would literally climb out the window of his New York office if anyone was in the front room wanting to see him. Didn't go to his daughter's wedding, had a pretty severe anxiety attack ahead of that. So very, very shy, anxious, and bouts of depression throughout his life. Really struggled with with that illness, which is now, to my, from what I've seen teaching at Dartmouth forever, is now epidemic in the younger generation. Okay, let's just jump in. I've organized the readings, and I'm going to read and then comment as we go along. And until we run out of time. Well, you don't want to say that to me. But I want to start with this piece from On the Sabbath. It's from One Man's Meat, which is the must read. If you have, wouldn't you say, Kathy, if they only read one book, it's this one.
And you can get it easily.
Yes.
I ordered these to give to people all the time.
Yes, yes. And this essay is on the Sabbath, and it just gives you you get right into his house in Brooklyn, and it tells you something about him, about his humor, and also about his view of religion. So, which I am also a Unitarian minister. That got dropped out of the, but I don't know if you know anything about Unitarians, but we hold dear all religious beliefs, including atheists. So we embrace everyone in their own journey. So this is dear to my heart, this particular passage. It is Sunday, mid-morning, Sunday in the living room, Sunday in the kitchen, Sunday in the woodshed, Sunday down the road in the village. I hear the bells calling me to share God's grace. I enter the living room a Sunday man, carrying a folder of work, clippings, letters, small, ungerminated thoughts in plain wrappers, a writer's I can't pronounce anything tonight. A writer's ridicule. I stand a moment listening to the bells 3 miles away, the hopeful, chiding bells. Procrastinating, I snap the radio on, and it is Sunday in the radio cabinet, too. Now, he has quotes from the radio, and I'm going to just do air quotes as I try to capture this. More like the Master is my daily prayer, a hymn singer in the Nazarene Church of South Blur, Maine, into my Sunday living room, spreading a frail soprano along the shelf among the geraniums and the freesia and the hyacinths where stand the authors without their jackets, Henry James, Willa Cather, D.H. Lawrence, A.P. Herbert, Frank T. Mullen, W.H. Hudson, their heads unbowed, looking straight ahead. We dedicate this hymn to Miss Nellie Blur, a shut-in of South Bend. Next Sunday, we shall take up the first of the Beatitudes, and until then, God bless you. I sit down, opening the work folder. An organ prelude. The organ makes a curious whine, sentimental, grandiose, half cello, half bagpipes. A prelude somewhere in a wired church on this Sunday morning in this year of our somewhere into the church, as into the church 3 miles away where bells have just grown silent, must now be coming the people to the Lord, singing by twos and threes, and the ushers seating them, and the bowing and the handing the printed program. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Hesitatingly, the assembled voices, embarrassed at the sudden sound of their own once weak excursion in piety, the too weak, the overstrong, praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Dad? My boy enters the living room where Sunday is. He wears corduroy trousers and carries a police whistle. What? It sounds as though you had turned the bottom part of this house into a church. Yes, it does. Acts the 11th chapter. Acts the 11th chapter. The little boy picks up a book, subsides, unlistening, discarding the world of the room, the world of the radio, setting up for himself a tight little world inside the covers of a book. There are many worlds. I see by my folder that in Flushing, the village of tomorrow, the people are building a temple to the Lord at a cost of $250,000. That's the World's Fair in Flushing. Or is it $300,000? The world of tomorrow has so many responsibilities, and on top of everything, religion. We thank thee that thou art merciful. And it goes on for several pages. I don't mean to imply he was an atheist. He wouldn't have called himself an atheist. But his church was the out of doors, I should say, to quote Dickinson. I want to introduce you to some of the politics of this magnificent thinker. And again, it's this, just as the first quote, he has this incredible combination of humor with very serious and heavy topics. This is October, also from One Man's Meat, from Clean Days, from October 1938. Long before the coming of the cold, I was on the barn roof, laying clear cedar shingles 5 inches to the weather. My neighbors' roofs all showed signs of activity, so I built some staging and mounted my own beanstalk to see what I could see. It seems a long while ago that I was up there, hanging on by the seat of my pants, those clear days at the edge of frost, with a view of pasture, woods, sea, hills, and my pumpkin patch stretched out below in serene abundance. I stayed on the barn, steadily laying shingles, all during the days when Mr. Chamberlain, the Duce, and the Führer were arranging their horse trade. What can I say? He's on the roof. He's reshingling his barn, and all of a sudden we're in the midst of it. It seemed a queer place to be during a world crisis. An odd thing to be doing there was no particular reason for making my roof tight, as the barn contained nothing but a croquet set, some swallows' nests, and a stuffed moose head. In my trance-like condition, waiting for the negotiations to end, I added a cupola to the roof to hold a vane that would show which way the wind blew. Sheer poetry. I'm not going to read from his essay on Anne Merrill Lindbergh's The Waves of the Future, but I do want to say I've recently read 2 books by Lynn Olson, a historian. Has any of you read these books? Citizens of London and Those Angry Days. Do you know her, Lynn Olson? Well, you have to start a book group, and you have to start with Lynn Olson. They're the most readable history. You can't put these books down. And they're about, the Citizens of London are about the American ambassador and businessmen who are in London trying to get word back to the United States that if we don't get into the war, Great Britain is going to fall to Hitler. And then Those Angry Days, her second book, well, I don't know which she wrote first, but the other book is about the struggle here between the isolationists and those who wanted to go to war. And of course the Lindberghs, Charles Lindbergh was the leading voice, spokesperson for isolationism. And it's a very sad history. And Anne Merrill Lindbergh, many of you may know, struggled mightily with her husband's position. She felt she had to stand by him, but she was greatly torn. She did not agree with him. And she had family members who were quite on the opposite side. But she did, in fact, write a book called The Waves of the Future, in which she defended his position. And E.B. White has a most amazing critical essay of this book. It's so graceful, but it's very clear how opposed he is to her position. Do take a look at that. when you can. I do want to read you from his essay, The Second World War. Again, this was published in September 1939. You all remember what happened September 1st, 1939. Germany rolled into Poland and began World War II. So, E.B. White writes in The New Yorker, "War comes to each of us in his own fashion. Early on that Sunday, when England and France finally lost their patience, wishing to put my affairs in order, I cleaned my comb and brush, pouring a few drops of household ammonia into a bowl of water, running the comb through the brush, then brushing the comb with a nail brush. At breakfast, there was a house guest in a bathrobe. She approached the war intellectually through Versailles. After breakfast, I went to that paragraph, by the way, is a poem in and of itself. But he goes on. After breakfast, I went to the garage and sorted some nails, putting the clabbered nails together in a bunch, the 60-penny nails together, the boarding nails together in cans. The blade of my jackknife being stiff, I eased it with a few drops of penetrating oil. Notice the intense detail of total attention to the present. We decided we would go to church, a solemn place for a solemn hour. The preparation was hurried as though we were organizing a picnic on the spur of the moment. Church is at 10:30 here. The little boy was in tears about having to wear the blue suit, yet wanting to go. I wore a hat I found in a closet. The minister, a young fellow I recently sold some old hens to for $1 apiece, said he believed the meek would inherit the earth. We sang, "Am I a soldier of the cross? Are there no foes for me to fight?" The storekeeper passed the plate. When we got home, I went out to the barn to fix some chum bait, and somebody came over after a while and announced, "Dinner and the king." The words came with painful slowness as we all sat and chewed. Thus began the Second War for Democracy. And I take it you got that he's referring to the broadcast of the King's speech, of which this absolutely exquisite movie has been made, which is a must-see if you have not yet seen it. So moving on these dates, so that was September 1939, and now we have December 7th. It's marked December 1941, but it's obviously after December 7th when we all found out about Pearl Harbor. This is from his essay, Intimations, in One Man's Meat. A light fall of snow in the night, and this morning the fields look like a man's face when he has used too much powder after a shave. A few little apples still cling to one of the old trees. They catch the light and perform a frosted miracle of ornamentation. Do you all remember winter? I gave a talk at the Unitarian Church in Chester Sunday, and it was focused on, it was really another reading of E.B. White, but I had pulled out all sorts of winter passages, and I had prepared it before I knew Sunday this week was going to be such a disaster, and so I called it my snow dance. That if we read enough of E.B. White's gorgeous descriptions of winter, maybe it would come back to us. I don't know that it worked. Apparently not. The sheep moved about restlessly, finding little to satisfy them on the hard earth. How quickly life's accents shifted on that sudden and unforgettable Sunday, the fateful 7th of December. My wife was getting a hot water bag for somebody, and somehow she managed to lose the stopper down the toilet beyond recall. This grotesque little incident seemed to upset her to a disproportionate degree. It was because she felt that now that the war had begun in earnest, There was no excuse for any clumsiness in home nursing. The loss of the stopper suddenly seemed as severe a blow as the loss of a battleship. Life, which for 2 years had had a rather dreamlike quality, came instantly into sharp focus. The time for losing hot water bag stoppers was over and gone. And then he talks a little bit about Hitler and then goes on again. I'm going to pick it up a little bit later. The passionate love of Americans for their America will have a lot to do with winning the war. It is an odd thing, though. The very patriotism on which we now rely is the thing that must eventually be in part relinquished if the war is ever to find a lasting peace and an end to these butcheries. To hold America in one's thoughts is like holding a love letter in one's hand. It has so special a meaning. Since I started writing this column, snow has begun falling again. I sit in my room watching the reenactment of this stagey old phenomena outside the window. For this picture, for this privilege, this cameo of New England with snow falling, I would give everything. Yet all the time I know that this very loyalty, this feeling of being part of a special place, this respect for one's native scene, I know that such emotions have had a big part in the world's wars. Who is there big enough to love the whole planet? We must find such people for the next society. Is that the most beautiful? And then he goes on. Although supranationalism often seems hopelessly distant or impractical, there is one rather encouraging sign in the sky. We have lately at least one large new group of people to whom the planet does come first. I mean scientists. Scientists, however undiscriminating it has seemed in the bestowal of its gifts, has no disturbing club affiliations. It eschews nationality. It is preoccupied with an atom, not an atoll. And he goes on. This is, given that how scientists have been yes, thank you for the word, vilified over the last 40 years and not listened to. We knew today's weather would come. We knew 40 years ago. So this was written in 1941. I'm going to read a little bit more. I'm sorry. I have to do this. From the same essay. Before you can be a supranationalist, you have first to be a naturalist and feel the ground under you making a whole circle, the planet. It is easier for a man to be loyal to his club than to this planet. The bylaws are shorter and he is personally acquainted with the other members. A club, moreover, or a nation, has a most attractive offer to make it. It offers the right to be exclusive. There are not many of us who are physically constituted to resist this strange delight, this nourishing privilege. It is at the bottom of all fraternities, societies, orders. It is at the bottom of most trouble. The planet holds out no such inducement. The planet is everybody's. All it offers is the grass, the sky, the water, and the ineluctable dream of peace and fruition. Intimations. It's in one man's meat. Intimations. Written December 1941. So Martha White, his daughter, collected, this is his daughter, not his granddaughter. It is granddaughter, sorry. Collected some passages. I'm going to read a couple of them. But I have several collections of his work, and one of the collections has excerpted about a page-long passages from his, and I found it so frustrating today looking over this book. I hadn't actually looked at it yet. I had just gotten it in the mail. You can't really appreciate the complexity that he holds. I'm telling my writing students all the time, hold the complexity, hold the paradox. You drive toward the paradox in everything that you write, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, academic writing. Hold the paradox. Don't reduce the complexity. That's fascism, reductionism. Hold the complexity, which White does so beautifully, and you've seen these in these passages, with the humor and the heaviness, the politics and the personal, all interwoven, everything. But when you excerpt him, you take one little story about the roof, for instance, out of that essay, you lose it. You have a cute little story, but you don't get the power of the whole essay. So I think I'm going to mail this stupid book back. I think it's called something about E.B. White's essays for the New Yorker, but it's not the whole essays. It's just excerpts. But anyway, Martha White did a nice job on a few of these, and I do want to. So in the 50s, some of you will remember the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he wrote a letter to the New York Herald Tribune, 1947. Quote, "I am a member of a party of one, and I live in an age of fear. Nothing lately has unsettled my party and raised my fears so much as your editorial on Thanksgiving Day, suggesting that employees should be required to state their beliefs in order to hold their jobs." Remember the loyalty oaths? "The idea is inconsistent with our constitutional theory and has been stubbornly opposed by watchful men since the early days of the Republic. I can only assume that your editorial writer, in a hurry to get home for Thanksgiving, tripped over the First Amendment and thought it was the office cat." Pure White. Perfect. He was, well, I won't say, I'm not even going to introduce this. This is, I think, my favorite passage of all. January 26, 1946. This is an essay in the New Yorker. "At their earliest convenience, the delegates to the United Nations organization should form an orchestra. There must be, among those 700 men and women, enough fiddlers, flautists, cellists, trombonists, and drummers to make up a sizable band. And if the delegates were to organize one and perform together, the effect on the world would be incalculable. Eleanor Roosevelt could learn the triangle. Once a week, all deliberations, all matters of state should be put aside, and the public invited to the Assembly Hall to hear that rarest of sounds, the concord of nations. Next morning, the papers, instead of carrying the latest installment in the long, uneasy story of international dissension, could report that the second movement had never been more solidly handled by the strings, and that Wyszynski turned in a masterful performance on the glockenspiel." Wyszynski being the foreign minister of Russia, the Soviet Union. "There is, in fact, great need that the UNO, United Nations, delegates find some human activity or pastime which will illustrate people's ability to lose themselves in a universal theme, to harmonize and to create beauty by following a single score rather than 51 separate scores. How heartbreaking is this? We'll keep it there. You may know that he loved dogs. He loved all animals, as you know. You've all read Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little? Because if you haven't read them recently, if you haven't read them in the last 2 years, reread them. I'm really here to boss you around tonight. My only goal tonight is to get you to run home and read these books. This is from Bedfellows. Do you all remember who Dean Acheson was? Secretary of State, and he was just around forever, wasn't he, after the war? You just have to know who he was to get this. And Fred was, he had many dachshunds, but Fred was the one that he wrote most about, and even after Fred was gone, his spirit lived on in many of his writings. And this is along this issue of the loyalty oath as well. The loyalty theme also relates to Fred, who presses ever more heavily against me this morning. Fred was intensely loyal to himself, as every strong individualist must be. He held unshakable convictions like Harry Truman. He was absolutely sure that he was in possession of the truth. Because he was loyal to himself, I found his eccentricities supportable. Actually, he contributed greatly to the general health and security of the household. Nothing has been quite the same since he departed. His views were largely of a dissenting nature, yet in tearing us apart, he somehow held us together. In obstructing, he strengthened us. In criticizing, he informed. In his rich, aromatic heresy, he nourished our faith. He was also a plain damn nuisance. I must not forget that. So this Bedfellows essay, I'm sorry I should have told you, was written in 1956. So dissension, as you remember, was not considered a patriotic thing to do, right? So he goes on, the matter of faith has been in the papers again lately. President Eisenhower, I will now move over and welcome a Republican into bed along with my other visitors, has come out for prayer and has emphasized that most Americans are motivated, as they surely are, by religious faith. The Herald Tribune headed this story, quote, "President says prayer is part of democracy," end quote. The implication in such a pronouncement emanating from the seat of government is that religious faith is a condition or even a precondition of the democratic life. This is just wrong. A president should pray whenever and wherever he feels like it. Most presidents have prayed hard and long, and some of them in desperation and in agony. But I don't think a president should advertise prayer. That is a different thing. Democracy, if I understand it at all, is a society in which the unbeliever feels undisturbed and at home. I didn't get to the Dean Acheson part, but never mind. You'll read it. You'll read it. The essay is Bedfellows. So, another essay is called Coon Tree, where he starts the essay talking about a coon that lives outside his window, and the coon goes down face first, down right about 2 feet from the ground, then she turns around and backs down. And he goes on for several pages about this phenomenon and why is she doing it, etc. It's great, the same great detail that you've heard already tonight. But the essay is really about atomic energy. So I'll read you where he gets to that. Again, he has the most amazing ability, I've never seen a writer do it as well, of making the difficult palatable. One of the things I struggle with in my writing classes in the last few years, I've focused solely on the environment. I've titled the course Voice in the Wilderness from Dartmouth's motto. And trying to talk about climate change and the loss of wilderness around the planet, and habitat, et cetera, trying to talk about that without having the students glaze over and spread the word that it's the most depressing course in the entire curriculum. It's really tricky. And I think I still have a lot to learn from E.B. White's finesse, writing finesse here, from Coon Tree. So I should give you the date of this, June 1956. I am not convinced that atomic energy, which is currently said to be man's best hope for a better life, is his best hope at all, or even a good bet. I'm not sure energy is his basic problem, although the weight of opinion is against me. I would feel more optimistic about a bright future for man if he spent less time proving that he can outwit nature, and more time tasting her sweetness and respecting her seniority. Almost every bulletin I receive from my country agent is full of wild schemes for boxing nature's ears and throwing dust in her eyes, and the last issue of the Rural New Yorker contained a tiny item saying that poultrymen had, quote, volunteered to quit feeding diphenylparaphenylene diamine to chickens because it can cause illness in persons. Dash, one of the tardiest pieces of volunteer activity I ever heard of. Yesterday, it was reported in the news that atomic radiation is cumulative and that no matter how small the dose, it harms the person receiving it and all his descendants. Thus, a lifetime of dental x-rays and other familiar bombardments and fallouts may finally spell not better teeth and better medicine, but no teeth and no medicine, and a chicken dinner may become just another word for bellyache. The raccoon, so now he goes back to the raccoon. The raccoon, for all her limitation, seems to me better adjusted to life on Earth than men are. She has never taken a tranquilizing pill, has never been x-rayed to see whether she was going to have twins, has never added DPPD to the boiler mash, and is not out at night looking for thorium in rocks. She is out looking for frogs in the pond. He goes on then to have this gorgeous long ode to his wood stove and how it's superior to the electric stove that they've installed in the corner of the kitchen. And those of us who have heated and cooked with wood know that argument well. How are we doing on time? So when do you usually, because I want to leave, you usually leave at 8:30, 8:15? Midnight, okay. That's good, all right. The love of animals. By the way, I can't recommend enough Sims' book, his biography. It's so tender, it's so beautiful, how he traces his whole life. And it ties in with White's anxiety and depression problems and his profound shyness. His connection with animals gave him a freedom and a camaraderie there that was profound, and that we, of course, get. Let's see here. I'm not going to be able to find this. Not sure. Okay, well, let's go. I'm going to go to Sims' quote. This is from the wonderful book by Sims, E.B. White, Talking Animals. What is the title of the book? Bob, can you just look at that book or somebody? What's the title? The Sims book? No, that's the wrong book. Oh, where is the Sims book? Do I have it here? Oh, okay, fine, good. So this is from Sims' book, and he quotes White in this paragraph beautifully. In everyday life, White saw animals with the view of a farmer and an amateur naturalist. He knew how to increase egg production among his chickens, how to dock a lamb's tail, how to give a pig an enema. Yet apparently, and he writes about all that. Yet apparently, without a flicker of what a psychologist would call cognitive dissonance, he also saw animals as personality-rich companions on his own fanciful journey. He interpreted a Boston Terrier's bark as, quote, "I'm in love and I'm going crazy," end quote. When his hen house's brooder stove burned itself out, he said he found the chicks, quote, "standing around with their collars turned up, blowing on their hands and looking like snow removal gang under the L on a bitter winter's midnight," end quote. Of his legendarily stubborn dachshund Fred, White wrote, quote, "And when I answer his peremptory scratch at the door and hold the door open for him to walk through, he stops in the middle and lights a cigarette just to hold me up." Animals, Sims writes, were White's favorite people. So this of course, it's very controversial to anthropomorphize animals. And so people get all upset about that. But what's the difference between anthropomorphizing and personifying? And Sims argues that what White is doing is personifying out of a profound empathy, and that he was able to convey that empathy by giving animals the power of speech. And of course, in Charlotte's Web, there's only one human that can understand that speech, right? That not all humans can hear it. He is meticulous in his scientific detail. How many of you have read The Trumpet of the Swan, his third child's book? I actually had never even heard of it, I'm embarrassed to say, until Allie asked me to learn something about why. And I listened to it on tape, and it was extraordinarily full of scientific detail, so that a child read, as well as being a fabulous read, right? So while children are absorbing this wonderful story, he's feeding them the accuracy. And when he was writing Charlotte's Web, he took 2 years to write it. The editor, he was famous by then, and so the editors, needless to say, were chomping at the bit to get this manuscript. And at the end of 2 years, White said he wasn't ready yet. He spent another whole year studying spiders. Read, deciding what species of spider Charlotte should be. And if you remember the book, there is a lot of detail that is very specific to the specific species he chose for Charlotte to be. And it's very, very important. So it was held up a whole year so that he could get this scientific detail accurate and consistent with the fictional part of the book. In his essay on Death of a Pig, I mean, he was a farmer. He did kill pigs. But he also was a non-speciesist, I would argue. Speciesism as in sexism and racism, speciesism being sort of a new word that's been coined, referring to the belief that one species is more important than another, namely humans. I would say that he was not a speciesist in that sense. The quote from the Death of the Pig essay, which is so hilarious, he said, the pig was quite sick, and he was grieving. It died of illness, as I remember. And he said, "I was grieving the pig, not the pork," which is humorous, but also so poignant. He was able to distinguish that. I've never been able to do that myself, but That's a wonderful essay, The Death of a Pig. It's worth reading. If you're a meat eater, you should read that. You eat that essay. Yeah, read that essay. So, in my expert, and then I'm just going to wind up here a little so we can talk. But 3 wonderful discoveries came. You know how it's wonderful when you introduce friends, the 2 beloved people, and you finally get them together and they like each other. Well, it was such a joy for me to discover a connection that E.B. White had to actually 3 of my other favorite authors. One, of course, was Thoreau. I'm pronouncing it properly. After 50 years of mispronouncing it, the Thoreau Society says it's to be pronounced Thoreau. He writes a great deal about Thoreau, and he says that he owns only one book, and that is Walden. And as I said earlier, he said every college graduate should write. But he's said some pretty funny things also about Walden, which I want to read to you. Henry Thoreau has probably been more widely misconstrued than any other person of comparable literary stature. This is from his essay, The Individualist. He got a reputation for being a naturalist, and he was not much of a naturalist. He got a reputation for being a hermit, and he was no hermit. He was a writer, is what he was. Walden is the only book I own, although there are some others unclaimed on my shelf. Every man, I think, reads one book in his life, and this is mine. It is not the best book I ever encountered, perhaps, but it is for me the handiest, and I keep it about me in much the same way one carries a handkerchief, for relief in moments of defluxion or despair. He has several essays on Thoreau and Walden. One, he takes Henry back to Walden, and he's talking to him. It's just a magnificent essay. The second discovery is his connection with Rachel Carson, and who is perhaps the biggest hero to me of all. In fact, I said to a student last term, one of the brightest students I've ever had and most committed to the environment, I said to her at the end of the term, I said, "Catherine, I'm counting on you to become the next Rachel Carson." And she knew enough about Carson. She just flushed. I mean, she really got the compliment. And it was also a challenge to her to keep working, which she will. So Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring, bestseller, The Beginning of the Environmental Movement. Rachel Carson is responsible for the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, etc. She, in the 60s, dying of cancer, spoke in front of the congressional hearings, her life was endangered because the chemical companies were going after her, quite literally. And in fact, in Newport last June, when I gave a version of this talk, a gentleman came up to me afterwards, and I'm regretting I didn't get his name and email, saying that he worked for a chemical company in those days, and he remembers exactly what I was saying, that they were rabidly trying to silence her, to come up with some way to shame her. And she kept her cancer totally secret because she was sure that they would just say, oh, she's just embittered because she has cancer, so trying to dismiss her work. But so the relationship with E.B. White is that Carson was Carson first wrote a letter to Reader's Digest in 1945 proposing an article on the destructive effects of spraying DDT, and was turned down. In 1951, the New Yorker serialized excerpts of her manuscript, A Profile of the Sea, which later became The Sea Around Us, her first book. So that she was first published there. And then in 1958, she received this letter, this famous letter from Olga Huckins about all the birds dying on Long Island and from the spraying. And Carson approached E.B. White to say, would you please write a series of articles on this pesticides? And he said, in his wisdom, the New Yorker very much wants to publish a series of articles. We want you to write it. And he knew by then what a fabulous writer she was. I mean, the uniqueness, and this is the compliment I was giving my student, the uniqueness of Rachel Carson is not only was she a scientist and knew science, but she was one of very few scientists who actually could write well. And she was taught writing at Chatham College, a small women's college in Pittsburgh, which was my first teaching job in the philosophy department of Chatham College coming out of graduate school. I didn't really even know who Carson was, although they were touting her as their most famous alum. Anyway, she did write the series, was published and in serial form, and became Silent Spring, which really literally changed the world. It was one of the most, you could say the 5 most important books in the last 200 years. I'd certainly put Silent Spring there. And it's, by the way, beautifully readable. So if you haven't read that book in the last 5 years, do. And it's also beautiful in terms of not just leaving you in dark despair, but being hopeful. And the third writer, and I'll just be brief about this, is Elizabeth Bishop, the great American poet. And I've been studying Elizabeth Bishop, and lo and behold, oh boy, I've got to get to Stuart Little. I'm going to skip this. But Elizabeth Bishop and her lover Loda from Brazil were at the farm, 2 dinners at the farm. Elizabeth Bishop and Catherine White were very close friends. Catherine was her editor at the New Yorker, but also Andy as well. So that's and if you want to look at these letters after the break, please do. So it's just so nice to think of all of them all together. You know? Okay. So just a word about Charlotte's Web. I can't resist because this is such a famous. This was, I think, this is the most published book, most sold book of all children's book ever. I just want to read you the opening. May I? Yeah? Chapter 1, Before Breakfast. Where's Papa going with that axe? Perhaps the most famous opening line next to Call Me Ishmael. What an opening for a children's book. Notice how he just goes right to it. And he had to fight editors on this book a lot, you can imagine. Where's Papa going with that axe? Said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. Out to the hog house, replied Mrs. Arable. Some pigs were born last night. I don't see why he needs an axe, continued Fern, who was only 8. Well, said her mother, one of the pigs is a runt. It's very small and weak, and it will never amount to anything, so your father's decided to do away with it. Do away with it? Shrieked Fern. You mean kill it, just because it's smaller than the others? Mrs. Arable put a pitcher of cream on the table. Don't yell, Fern, she said. Your father's right. The pig would probably die anyway. Fern pushed the chair out of the way and ran outdoors. The grass was wet, and the earth smelled of springtime. Fern's sneakers were sopping by the time she caught up with her father. Please don't kill it, she sobbed. It's unfair. Mr. Arable stopped walking. Fern, he said gently, you will have to learn to control yourself. Control myself, yelled Fern. This is a matter of life and death, and you talk about controlling myself? Tears ran down her cheeks, and she took hold of the axe and tried to pull it out of her father's hand. Fern, said Mr. Arable, I know more about raising a litter of pigs than you do. A weakling makes trouble. Now run along. But it's unfair, cried Fern. The pig couldn't help being born small, could it? If I had been very small at birth, would you have killed me? This is tough stuff for a kid's book. Mr. Arable smiled. Certainly not, he said, looking down on his daughter with love. But this is different. A little girl is one thing, a little runty pig is another. I see no difference, replied Fern. This is the most terrible case of injustice I ever heard of. I would love to have a discussion with E.B. White about the animal rights movement of today. I think he'd be right there. Stuart Little, I have to tell you, when I was preparing this about a year ago, we're starting to study White, I was at a dinner with dear friends, one of whom is a retired distinguished law professor from University of Michigan. And I mentioned E.B. White, and he said, my favorite book in the world is Stuart Little. And he went on, for every graduating class for 30 years, I read the last few pages to my students as my parting words to them. And so as my parting words to you, I want to remind you of the end of Stuart Little and read you just the last few things, and then we'll open it up to questions. You remember that Stuart Little set out into the world to find his love, the bird Margolis. How do you pronounce her name? Margola. Yeah? Is that right? Yeah. And she has flown north. Her DNA has told her to fly north. And so Stuart runs into all these people, but he comes to a fork in the road. Half a mile out of town, the road forked. One road seemed to go off toward the west. The other road continued north. Stuart drew up to the side of the northbound road and got out to look the situation over. To his surprise, he discovered there was a man sitting in the ditch leaning against a signpost. The man wore spurs on his legs. He also wore a heavy leather belt, and Stuart realized that he must be a repairman for the telephone company. Good morning. You remember, for those of you who haven't read it, Stuart's a little mouse. Good morning, said Stuart in a friendly voice. The repairman raised one hand to his head in a salute. Stuart sat down in a ditch beside him and breathed deeply of the fresh, sweet air. It's going to be a fine day, he observed. Yes, agreed the repairman, a fine day. I'm looking forward to climbing my poles. I wish you fair skies and a tight grip, said Stuart. By the way, do you ever see any birds at the tops of your poles? Yes, I see birds in great numbers. Well, if you ever run across a bird named Margola, said Stuart, I'd appreciate if you would drop me a line. Here's my card. Describe the bird, said the repairman, taking out pad and pencil. This detail. So he has the repairman pay so much attention. Brown, said Stuart, brown with a streak of yellow on her bosom. Know where she comes from, asked the man. She comes from fields once tall with wheat, from pastures deep in fern and thistle. She comes from vales of meadowsweet, and she loves to whistle. The repairman wrote it all down briefly. Fields, wheat, pastures, fern, and thistle. Vales, meadowsweet, enjoys whistling. Then he put the pad back in his pocket and tucked Stuart's card away in his wallet. I'll keep my eyes open, he said. Stuart thanked him. They sat for a while in silence. Then the man spoke. Which direction are you headed? North, said Stuart. North is nice, said the repairman. I've always enjoyed going north. Of course, southwest is fine direction too. Yes, I suppose it is, said Stuart. And there's east, continued the repairman. I once had an interesting experience on an easterly course. Do you want to tell me about it? No, thanks. Do you want me to tell you about it? No, thanks, said Stuart. The repairman seemed disappointed, but he kept right on talking. There's something about north, he said, something that sets it apart from all other directions. And you northerners like this passage especially. A person who is heading north is not making any mistake, in my opinion. That's the way I look at it, said Stuart. I rather expect that from now on I shall be traveling north until the end of my days. Worse things than that could happen to a person, said the repairman. Yes, I know, replied Stuart. Following a broken telephone line north, I have come upon some wonderful places, continued the repairman. Swamps where cedars grow and turtles wait on logs, but not for anything in particular. Fields bordered by crooked fences broken by years of standing still. Orchards so old they have forgotten where the farmhouse is. In the north, I have eaten my lunch in pastures rank with ferns and junipers, all under fair skies with the wind blowing. My business has taken me into spruce woods on winter nights where the snow lay deep and soft, a perfect place for a carnival of rabbits. Notice how he is addressing children as grown-ups, and he has this wonderful, he writes about this, how important it is to not talk down to children, how ridiculous that is. We must speak up to children, he says. So this is the repairman still. I have sat at peace on the freight platforms of railroad junctions in the north in the warm hours and with warm smells. I know fresh lakes in the north undisturbed except by fish and hawk and, of course, by the telephone company, which has to follow its nose. I know all these places well. They are a long way from here. Don't forget that. And a person who is looking for something doesn't travel very fast. That's perfectly true, said Stuart. Well, I guess I'd be going. Better be going. Thank you for your friendly remarks. Not at all, said the repairman. I hope you find that bird. Stuart rose from the ditch, climbed into his car, and started up the road that led toward the north. The sun was just coming up over the hills on his right. As he peered ahead into the great land that stretched before him, the way seemed long, but the sky was bright, and he somehow felt he was headed in the right direction. Amen. Thank you very much. Now we can discuss. The floor is open. Thoughts? Favorite passages? Yes.
Yes, well, I was thinking of what drew Catherine to E.B. White, and one of the things was that she described dental floss as tooth thread.
Tooth twine? Tooth thread, yeah. She recognized him fairly immediately as a writer she wanted to hire. In fact, he argued about it. He didn't want to come into the office. He didn't want to work there. And they finally negotiated that he would come in one day on Thursdays only. Yes?
My daughter called me one time. She married into the White family, and she called me up. She said, Dad, I have to tell you something. I said, what's happening? She said, right now, Sam and I are carrying E.B. White's desk down the stairs.
Oh, my Lord. Wow. Who did your daughter marry?
She married
His great-grandson.
his great-grandson.
Oh.
Martha's son, Sam.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Are they involved in the boat business in Brooklyn?
Yes.
What a beautiful place. If you're ever in Brooklyn, you should go to that, and also to the library. I meant to mention the Whites gave a lot of money and a lot of time to develop this beautiful little library. And when I went and told the librarian that I was researching E.B. White, she just fell all over herself to help me. And she brought out this folder of crumpled papers, and I was able to photograph a lot of some of these old articles. And it's a wonderful little town and library. Yeah.
There's a disc, CD, it's called White on White.
Yes.
And it's his son Joel reading some, as he's dying.
Yes.
Reading some of his work back to him.
Yes.
And every once in a while he'd say, who wrote that? I say, you did. He said, oh, pretty good.
Yeah. That's a very nice tape. I've listened to it. Actually, it was looking, well, anyway, yeah. Yeah, Kathy.
I just want to say how thrilled I was at the things that you hit on, because his love of science was really amazing, and it is time. And in fact, I have to give my little lecture too about what you must read of his, but read the children's books to start, because then all the other books you'll have to stand in line for it. But Stuart Little was on the banned list for librarians because so many people were shocked that this human family had a mouse child. So
yes.
There's a wonderful little kerfuffle over that. And he worked on Charlotte's Web for a year and threw it out and started over with the girl as the protagonist. protagonist, he had a little boy at first, and he decided somehow it didn't work as well.
Yeah, I forgot.
So he was a perfectionist, he really was. But the adult book that you really have to read is One Man's Meat, and I read it in the early 70s, and both of my parents were in the Army in World War II, met on Hawaii right after Pearl Harbor, and for the first time I got such an incredibly important historic sense of the tug of war, as you were saying, between the isolationism and the, you know, the fear that we had to help Europe out, and then of course it spread further. But it's beautifully written, and his animal thing, right? That early on in this, he wrote, "My 36 pullets are ready to go into the laying house, and all the pamphlets say I must cull them rigidly. It strikes me the federal pamphleteers are strangely out of date, and it reminds him too much of what's happening in Europe." He can't do it.
Yeah.
But another book that is big and fat, but it will give you a tremendous sense of him, and at the same time kind of a review of a lot of the most important issues of the last century.
Yeah.
Because he's writing back and forth to his friends and his editors about important things that he was writing in the New Yorker about blacklisting, about Rachel Carson, about bomb testing in the Pacific, and everything that was important to him and to Catherine, and it's personal, but it's also global. And it's the letters. And his granddaughter, Martha, Sam's mom, updated this. This came out while I was working at Cornell and was my Bible, because so much of what he wrote was unsigned. And so I combed through this for every hint at something he was working on, and then I'd go looking for it, and then I'd write him and say, "Is this really you?" Because I can't find a signature, and he'd write me back. And very often he'd write me a cute little anecdote so I could include that in the bibliography of his stuff. And he was an incredibly humble writer. For decades he did the news breaks at the bottom of the page in the New Yorker, but he refused to take credit for them because he said somebody else would always spark his imagination for that. So he said he couldn't take full credit for those news breaks at the bottom. But even after they moved to Maine, these big fat envelopes would arrive of all these weird little oddball clippings, and they would hope he would sift through it and find some clever things to put at the bottoms of the pages. But just a couple other ones. I saw somebody had Here is New York.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful.
And it gets reprinted, so it's not hard to get. And it is just, I mean, if you have any experience going to New York once, he captures it so perfectly.
He also, I was going to quote that, and I just ran out of time. He has a gorgeous foreshadowing almost of 9/11 because he talks about New York being so precious and both a target and, oh God, it's just, it's very haunting.
And in fact, I had to order one that his stepson, Roger Angel, wrote a new introduction to. And that's Catherine's son by her first marriage, another huge New Yorker writer, and all of you who are baseball fans, you've got to read Roger Angel's books. And then he wrote Farewell to Model T, and here's his generosity again. Somebody had sent a piece about a Model T to the New Yorker, which they rejected. And the man's name was Lee Strout, but it inspired him to write his piece, and so he shared the credit. He wrote it under the pseudonym Lee Strout White. And it's been put out in a wonderful little book recently, Farewell to Model T and From Sea to Shining Sea. And but just also, I'm so thrilled you talked about his political passion, because he was very fond of him, and FDR asked him to write a pamphlet. And if you go to Washington, D.C. to the FDR Memorial, it's what's carved in these huge stone panels there about the 4 freedoms, because they were afraid people II were going to forget what they were fighting
Yeah,
about.
yeah.
And he wrote these beautiful things about the four freedoms. And it's, I went on a kids' tour, school trip, and came around the corner and went, so that was E.B. White stuff. And also just the most, because he was kind of the prize editorial writer at the New Yorker, he also had to write the obituaries. And his obituary of JFK is just, it's so economical.
Yeah.
And I mean, I have it.
It's beautiful. He also, his obituary for Rachel Carson is stunning, and it's such a radical environmental statement. She died in 1964. I have it here, by the way. I can show it to you if anyone wants to stay and look at it. It's absolutely exquisite. Thank you, Kathy, so much. I'm going to call on a few people that haven't spoken, then we'll get back to you. Yeah.
Along the line of that book of letters you have, I think there's a letter in there that he wrote to Catherine when he wanted to give up the job at the New Yorker.
Yeah.
And it's this phenomenal letter. I think that you can start, Dear Mrs. White. And it ranges from humor to this amazing earnestness of why I need to not do this anymore.
Yeah.
I thought it was astounding.
Yeah.
Well, their marriage really scandalized a lot of people. She was 8 years older than he, and she was a divorcee. And she actually flew out, or trained, I'm sure, didn't fly, trained out to Nevada to get a quickie divorce after being separated from her first husband for quite a long time. But in 1929, they got married, and Is Sex Necessary came out.
Yeah.
I think that was one reason he did end up working out of the New Yorker offices. He and Thurber shared an office.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
Thurber would do his crazy drawings just like a nervous twitch, and then he'd just ball them up and throw them in the wastebasket. And Andy took them out and flattened them and submitted them to the art department, which threw them away. Until Is Sex Necessary came out in a book, and it was a smash hit with all of Thurber's quirky, weird drawings, and then the New Yorker went, oh my God, we've been throwing away this stuff for 5 years now.
Yeah.
4 years.
Yeah.
They were great friends and great dog lovers.
Yes.
Their dachshunds and their crazy dog things were.
There's a hand back. Yes.
At one point in your very illuminating talk, you mentioned the complexity of some of White's prose. That would seem to run counter to one of the principles of Professor Strunk. But my question really is this, ma'am. Was any subsequent writer of note influenced in any way by E.B. White's style?
Every writer in America has been influenced by E.B. White's style. Who hasn't read this in your English, high school English course? Yes, it's complicated to talk about complexity in writing. Definitely it's about keeping things concise and simple. But simple is different than reductionism. So what I was trying to say is that, and tried to show you in the readings that I selected, was that he keeps a simple strain, so it's nothing difficult to understand. There are no dense metaphors. You don't know what he's talking about. It's very straightforward. But he holds a complexity. He doesn't reduce an idea to dogma or ideology. He stays loyal to the present, that whatever he's describing, he stays meticulously loyal to it. At the same time, if it's the snow outside the window or the pullets, or at the same time that he's trying to make a larger philosophical or political point. But if you have not read the essay so this is his famous book, Elements of Style, which is still being used in courses today. And much of it is from Strunk, his teacher, but the essay that's actually by White in this, An Approach to Style, is so worth rereading, even if you're not a writer. It's just so eloquent, and it will explain a lot of why you can't stand some of the stuff that's being published today. Well, there also don't appear to be editors like Catherine White out there anymore, or they're not being paid to have enough time to do it. Yes, father again of the White family. Yes, you have privilege by.
How I am. We went over there one time and we're trying to figure out with my daughter where are we going to stay. You know? So they said we have a little place, a house for you. It's called the Little House. So we went to the Little House, and the Little House is not a little house. It's on the water. It's beautiful. And I said to Sam, I said, Stuart Little.
Oh.
Is this when they were still in the fire, that E.B. White was still alive? No. Oh, okay. Yeah. Other questions, comments? I think we're getting to a point. I know you said we could stay till midnight, but anyone else? Comments? Well, you've been a wonderful audience, and thank you for listening to me reading. And you have to all promise to run out and read. Be nurtured by this wonderful, wonderful man. Thank you. Thank you, Bob, again.